Hi, everybody. Good evening. The man that you saw pictured in many of those slides is Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, who is here this evening. Let me tell you a little more formally about him. He served as Chief White House Domestic Policy Advisor to President Jimmy Carter. In the Clinton administration, he served as United States Ambassador to the European Union, Undersecretary of Commerce, Undersecretary of State, and Deputy Secretary of Treasury. He was Special Representative of the President and Secretary of State on Holocaust issues, with continuing responsibility on Holocaust issues in the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations. His books include President Carter, The White House Years, The Future of the Jews, How Global Forces are how global forces are impacting the Jewish people, Israel and its relationship with the United States, and Imperfect Justice, Looted Assets, Slave Labor, and the Unfinished Business of World War II, and of course his most recent book, The Art of Diplomacy, How American Negotiators Reached Historic Agreements That Changed the World. The book is available for purchase, and I hope you'll buy the book. I've read the book. I think you'll find it extraordinarily interesting. The foreword was written by Henry Kissinger, as I recall, who talked about it as such a wonderful introduction to the world of international negotiations. And of course, Ambassador Eizenstat will sign the book, personalize it, following the program as well. He is an international lawyer in Washington, D.C., and serves as chairman of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Council, to which he was appointed by President Biden. It is our privilege that he made the trip from Washington, D.C. this morning to be with us. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat. Over here. I'll tell you, Mr. Ambassador, you don't get this kind of water in Washington, D.C., only at Stephen Wise Temple. By the way, water used to come on a glass. You remember that? I don't need a PhD. I was excited that you were coming before I read your book, but I became especially excited having read your book, watching different interviews about you, and learning more about things that you did not only in our world, but in the Jewish community at large. So I want to get your thoughts on 5 different areas. I hope we'll get to all of them tonight. One of them will be examples of successful and perhaps unsuccessful negotiations and agreements that took place in most of our lifetimes. Talk with you about Iran, because Iran looms large on the world stage. Israel, of course, negotiations that worked historically, because you were a part of them, with Israel, Camp David I, why Camp David II didn't work, and of course the Abraham Accords, and also we have to talk about October 7th, because I want to get your thoughts about that. The fourth area is I want to speak with you about your role and what you've done for Holocaust victims. And finally, what you can teach us in this room about being good negotiators and good diplomats in our lives and the like. So with that, let's turn to number 1, if you will, examples of agreements which worked and didn't work. Let's start with a successful negotiation, the fall of the Berlin Wall.
So 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and I can assure you no one in the U.S. government or anywhere else believed that that would happen. And when it did, President George H.W. Bush and his Secretary of State James Baker, who wrote the preface to my book, seized that opportunity. They saw a historic opportunity to reunite the divided Germanys that had occurred after World War II with the Soviet zone and the Western zone in the West. And this was a tremendously heavy lift. At the time that it occurred, the French and the British and the Soviets, who were all the occupying Allied powers, were dead set against reunification. Remember that the Soviets had lost 20 million people in World War II. The British and French had twice fought world wars. In fact, Germany actually, with the French 3 times, 1870, First World War, and the Second World War. Margaret Thatcher famously, who was the Prime Minister of the UK at the time, said, "I love Germany so much I want to keep 2 of them." And in masterful negotiations, Jim Baker and George H.W. Bush were able to convince all of those reluctant allies not only to accept a united Germany, East and West, but for the Soviets, the extra step, which has relevance, by the way, to what's happening in Ukraine today, to accept this united Germany in NATO, within NATO. Huge lift. And it occurred in a part through personal diplomacy. And one of the lessons that I draw from this example is the importance of establishing a personal relationship of trust and confidence with your counterpart. Diplomacy is not a poker game. It's not a winner-take-all. You are dealing with sovereign nations who have their own constituencies. So, at a very difficult time in the negotiations, Jim Baker takes the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, Edward Shevardnadze, to his retreat at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, away from the lights of Moscow and Washington. And they bond personally. They talk about their hopes for their children and their grandchildren, for a peaceful union. And Baker says you really don't want a massive united Germany floating between the 2 blocs. You, the Soviet Union, will be better protected having them within NATO, where we can also look them over. So this was an enormous success, and one that endures to this day. I mean, Germany just had an election yesterday, and they have been a model democracy, and I negotiate with them every year on behalf of the Claims Conference on a pro bono basis for Holocaust survivors. And I'm negotiating with people who weren't even born in World War II, and yet they still feel a moral obligation. And the Bundestag, their parliament, has to pass what we've done. We've had $9.5 billion since I started in 2009, home care and pensions and so forth, and they passed the Bundestag with not one dissenting vote. Wow. So what Jim Baker and Bush put together has endured. Now, on the other side is something that's actually very relevant today, and that is, and we can talk about the failure of Camp David II in a different context, but it's the failure of the Afghan negotiations. So here's the lesson. We spent 20 years in Afghanistan. It was our longest war in American history. And we repeated a mistake we had made before. For all of his greatness, Henry Kissinger, who did write the foreword of the book, negotiated the end of the Vietnam War with the North Vietnamese, but not with the ally, South Vietnam, for whom we lost 58,000 men and women. They were nowhere to be found. And of course, they collapsed after we left. The same thing happened in Afghanistan. The negotiations in the Trump administration, and yes, continued in the Biden administration, were solely between the United States and the Taliban. The Afghan government was nowhere in the room. And then when we pulled out, it left that government totally exposed. We left all of the private contractors, told them to come back. There was no one to even repair the helicopters and military equipment. And then we were astonished that the government fell to the Taliban. Well, now this is a lesson we must learn. We'll get to the Ukraine in a minute, but I want to connect it. We are in serious sight of 3 times repeating this mistake, and that is negotiating over the heads of the Ukrainians, for whom we've been, in effect, supporting, with Russia. and leaving them out in the cold.
So, if you don't mind elaborating that a little bit about Ukraine, because I know that you have thoughts on what you think. You don't think there will be a peace agreement, as I recall, more of sort of an agreement similar to South and North Korea?
So that
An armistice, I
there are
guess
two
that's...
types of alternatives. One is like the end of the Korean War in 1953, which ended not in a peace treaty between North and South Korea, but rather an armistice at a dividing line called the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone. And there's been, although there's no peace agreement, there's been an armistice that's lasted for 70 years. Now, in part, it's because we have American troops there, but still it has. And so what's going to be very difficult is to give Zelensky and the Ukrainians enough of a guarantee, and I want to get to this in just 1 second. Henry Kissinger said, you can't win at the negotiating table what you don't achieve on the battlefield. That's why it's so important that we arm Ukraine, and why the Biden administration, of which I'm a part, made a serious mistake at a time when the Russians were on their heels and not supplying them more rapidly. Now, they basically are going to lose somewhere between 18 and 20% of their territory. It was a terrible mistake for our new Secretary of Defense to say in advance that they're not going to be in NATO, that they're going to lose a lot of their territory, because you're giving away the negotiating chips. But here's the danger, that they will negotiate behind Zelensky's back and present him with a fait accompli.
So in the scenario that you painted with an armistice agreement, is Ukraine expected to relinquish land to the Soviets?
Yes, I mean, so put yourself, I talked about the fact it's important when you negotiate with another country to put yourself in their shoes.
Sure.
So let's put ourselves now in Zelensky's shoes, okay? So we're at a negotiating table, and Putin's on one side, Zelensky's on the other, and Zelensky says to us, the United States, you have a famous saying, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. First time, 1994, in the Budapest Memorandum, the Russians agree that they will not invade Ukraine, in return for which Ukraine gives up the third largest nuclear force in the world.
And didn't the United States promise to defend Ukraine under
we
those?
did. And then second time, 2015, so-called Minsk agreements, that's when they had already taken Crimea in violation of the first agreement. And in addition to that, they had these so-called little green men that they sent in, who were really Russian soldiers, and they were fighting in the very area they're fighting in now, the Donbass area. Okay, so what did Minsk say? And we, the United States, assured in writing that we would protect the Ukrainians. What happened was, we said, if you will stop the fighting, we will assure that Russia will go no further. 2015. Fast forward 7 years, we're now at 2022. February 21st, February 22. Putin says publicly, quote unquote, Minsk is no more. He literally rips it up. 3 days later, they start to go into Kyiv and try to take the whole country over. So Zelensky's going to say, well, I've been fooled twice. My country's been fooled twice. What guarantee are you going to give me if I sign on the dotted line now? You're not going to let me into NATO, which has a mutual security agreement. You're talking about only giving me arms if I give you half the profits of all my minerals. What guarantee do I have that Putin won't rest, relax, rearm, and come at me again, and you won't be there for me?
And how do you, as an American, respond to that?
So the only way to respond is twofold. Number one, to expedite they're not going to get into NATO. There are too many countries against it. Expedite their entrance into the European Union, which I was ambassador to. It will be very hard for Russia to invade an EU country. Second, to have bilateral defense agreements, as Biden reached 6 months before he left office, a 10-year agreement to provide sophisticated arms, and if the Swedes, the Brits, the French, the Germans do the same thing, then he will have at least sufficient arms to protect himself. And last, and I think this is going to happen, I think there won't be a NATO force there, but there'll be maybe 5,000 to 10,000 British, French, perhaps Spanish troops as a tripwire.
I want to turn to Iran because it also looms so large, and in order to understand current-day Iran, it's important to look back at least a few decades. In 1977, it's New Year's Eve, and you note that President Carter, and we'll get to your relationship with the president, which was extraordinary. You gave the eulogy at his funeral, as I recall. President Carter, and this is 2 years before the revolution, makes a toast on New Year's Eve, saying that Iran is the, quote, island of stability in a turbulent corner of the world. 2 years later, the Shah is overthrown. He runs for his life. The Khomeini returns from exile. Now Iran is on the world stage. We know the history. We remember the embassy, American embassy being taken. The U.S. tries to rescue them. That ends up in a disaster. Iran since has publicly made it clear that its goal, one of its goals, is to destroy Israel, to destroy the United States. So I have a series of questions. The first is, Iran is a theocracy, a radical theocracy, meaning that it's run by people for whom a religious perspective is more important than necessarily what is good for the population. If that's true, how is negotiating with a theocracy different than negotiating with, say, a communist regime or totalitarian?
So let's go back, and I have some very dear friends from the Iranian Jewish community here, Sam Kermanian and Eli and others. That statement that President Carter made on New Year's Eve, 1977, in Tehran, about an island of stability, that is what the CIA gave him information about. But let's go even more recent. 6 weeks, not 2 years, 6 weeks before the Shah is forced out of his country, the CIA reported, and I have it paper in my book, that Iran is in neither a revolutionary nor even a pre-revolutionary state.
Wow.
The CIA, this is our chief ally. I mean, 6 presidents, Republican and Democrat, had supported the Shah since 1953, given him an open shopping list and everything he wanted. They didn't know, Rabbi, that not only was it not a pre-revolutionary state, they didn't know he had incurable cancer and therefore was not making sound decisions. When you have bad intelligence, and I want to talk about that in the Gaza context in a while, then you're going to have disastrous decision-making. So what happens is the following. Hostages are taken, and they're taken largely because the president was the last holdout out in his administration to an intense public campaign launched by David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger, that they had to let the Shah in for cancer treatments. He had been our ally for decades. And Carter said in the room to all of us, what happens if I let him in and then they take our diplomats hostage? He literally said that. What are you going to advise me to do then?
Wow. Okay,
so they get taken. We have the first meeting in the so-called Situation Room, not the one that Wolf Blitzer's in every night, the real Situation Room. And I raise my hand and I say, I think we should learn the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We should do what John Kennedy did in Cuba, and that is we should blockade what's called Karg Island, right off of the Iranian coast, and that's where 60% of their oil is exported from, and either man the harbors or blockade. That was not chosen. The president 2 weeks later, says to the hostage families at the White House, my number one priority is getting your loved ones back healthy, which he does 444 days later. But he had already transferred the leverage to the Ayatollah by saying that, not having the threat of military force even.
Right.
And that really deprived us. And then your question directly, dealing with a theocracy. We did not realize, we had several agreements with the Iranian government on the hostages. They were going to be transferred out of the embassy under the UN auspices and then taken out. Every time we had an agreement, Khomeini, the Ayatollah, who was supposedly only going to be a figurehead, who was the real decision maker, who hated the United States, hated Israel, every time we had an agreement, he vetoed it. He used the hostages as pawns to solidify his own initially shaky political status. And he only let them out the minute that Ronald Reagan was sworn in.
That day.
We negotiated their release, but he even wouldn't give Carter the satisfaction of doing it during his presidency.
So had those hostages been taken by a totalitarian or a communist regime, would we have negotiated any differently?
Well, yes, here's the interesting thing. Carter was not naive about this. So Khomeini comes back in early 1979, and we tried to block his coming back from France. We told the French, don't let him out. They did. He comes back. About 2 weeks later, communist students storm our embassy, the same embassy as was stormed November the 4th. Okay? And the Iranian government, with Khomeini, tells the police to break up the demonstrations and to protect the embassy. So Carter assumed the same thing would happen when we got word that they were starting to form outside of our embassy. The difference was these were not communist students. They were Islamic radical students. And Khomeini did not want to take them on because he feared that it would undercut his own political status.
So here we are 46 years later, after the revolution. Hamas, Hezbollah, so many other terrorist organizations are funded by Iran. In the last 6 months, Israel has basically destroyed their air defense system, from what I understand. They're more vulnerable now than ever. There's a few questions related to that then. This is current day. Does Israel have the ability to damage their nuclear facilities? Should Israel take action militarily to damage their nuclear facilities? And if so, what role should the United States play?
Okay, so let me answer that by, again, going back to the issue of good intelligence. Israel has almost remarkable intelligence inside Iran. It's truly unbelievable. This is a closed society with the Revolutionary Guard. They've assassinated their top nuclear scientists. They know they took out tons of documents and showed it to the International Atomic Energy Agency, showing how much progress they had made to a nuclear weapon. They got it out themselves. Right. It's unbelievable. And then they took out, as you said, their air defense system. So they have remarkable intelligence. Now I'm going to come back to Iran, but I want to contrast that with Gaza. So Dennis Ross and I chair a think tank in Jerusalem called the Jewish People's Policy Institute. And we were briefed by two Israeli generals who said that Gaza was our worst intelligence failure in our history, even worse than the 73 war. Why? Because under our eyes, they said, the Hamas had gone from being a terrorist group into a full-blown, well-trained, well-armed terrorist army, 35,000 people. And, they said, yes, we knew they had tunnels from Egypt into Gaza. We didn't know they had 150 to 200 miles of tunnels, some of which are 25 stories deep. Now, there's going to be a commission on this. How in the world do you allow a tunnel to be built 25 miles without knowing about it? So it's such a marked contrast with respect to Iran. Now, the question you asked is, can they bomb their nuclear facility? Well, Iran has no air defense system left now. Israel has heavily damaged all of their proxies, the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas, and they've really stripped their air defense system. So they can get in, but the Iranians are not dumb, and they have put a large number of their nuclear facilities very, very deep underground.
Right.
The only way that Israel could be successful in that, and that is to use the heaviest bombs that the United States has, which no president, by the way, has ever transferred to Israel.
They're like 2-ton, right? Something like that?
Yeah, they're mammoth bombs.
Right.
But for that to occur, Israel would have to refuel in midstream. It would have to go over a number of Arab countries. There would be pre-warnings. There is still a fairly significant Air Force left. So it wouldn't be impossible, but it would be very difficult. And what I'm hoping is that there will be an agreement to get them back into the nuclear agreement of 2015. Now, let me talk about that.
That's the JCPOA?
Yes.
Can you
So-
describe what that is to
I can.
everybody and how effective or not effective you think it was?
This occurred during the Obama administration. It's one of his best accomplishments, and John Kerry, Secretary Kerry. This was done in 2015 with what's called the P5+1. That is the permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany, and of course Iran. President Trump in 2018 pulled out of that agreement and said he wanted to use maximum pressure to get a better deal. Okay, then let's look at what was then and what is now. Under that agreement, Iran had to reduce their enriched uranium, which is the fuel for a bomb, down to 2.5%, which is civilian grade. It's nowhere near military grade. Today, since we pulled out under President Trump, it's 60%. They can go to 90%, which is weapons grade, in weeks. Number two, JCPOA dismantled 2/3 of their centrifuges. They now have, as a result of being out of the agreement, a whole new generation of centrifuges, which are what are used to spin the uranium. Number three, there was a plutonium plant at a town called Arak, A-R-A-K, which was another form of making a bomb. You make it with either plutonium or uranium. It was cemented in. The International Atomic Energy Agency had cameras all over Iran, spot inspections. No one, including the Trump administration, said that they had violated the agreement at all. Now that plutonium plant is back in action. So instead of being a year to 2 years away from a breakthrough, they're now weeks away from a breakthrough. And we're really at an existential moment where Israel has to make a decision and the United States has to make a decision, because we've both said we can't allow them to have a nuclear weapon. Do you try to get them back into something like the JCPOA, or do you take military action? And military action would be enormously destabilizing. You'd see oil prices go through the roof. You could be partially successful, but not 100% successful.
So the JCP, I think it's what is Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
Right.
Given how close they are to creating a nuclear bomb, why would why would they care? In other words, why would they agree to the JCPOA at this point?
The reason is that they are suffering greatly under the economic sanctions that we've had in effect. I mean, their currency is deeply depressed. They've got roaring inflation. They have regular demonstrations throughout the country against the regime because basic staples are not available. So they're under a lot of pressure. And of course, any agreement that they reach they will insist on the sanctions being eliminated or at least reduced, and some of the cash that we're freezing being given to them.
So if tomorrow morning it's reported in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times that Israel dropped those 2-ton bombs on Iran's nuclear facilities, would you be cheering, or would you be more cheered or more worried?
Well, first of all, I don't think they're going to get them.
So you don't think the United States would supply
We've
them?
never given them. Maybe Trump will do it. I mean, is he doing Israel a favor about giving them? I don't know, but we have no president, Republican or Democrat, has ever given that bomb. Second, it depends on what the results are. It would set back, but the reverberations in the region would be extraordinary. And here's my thinking, and I think it's really important. And I give Trump credit for the Abraham Accords. I've spent now time in the UAE. I've been there twice. They're transformative.
Mm-hmm.
In my opinion, Israel's real security against Iran comes not from being able to fly alone and try to drop bombs and think you're precisely going to hit every one. It's for being embedded in a coalition led by the United States with the moderate Sunni Arab countries. And that is not a pipe dream. They've already got peace agreements with Jordan, with Egypt, with Bahrain, with the UAE, with Morocco.
And Sudan.
And would have had one. I'll tell you honestly, we were within 2 to 3 weeks before October 7th of having one with Saudi Arabia. If we get the Saudis in, then that is really Israel's
Okay,
security.
this is, you moved ahead to something that I was going to get to, but this is really important now, so I want to ask a question about that. Michael Oren, who was sitting in that seat a couple of years ago before October 7th, I asked him about the Abraham Accords, and he said it was indeed a game changer. Initially, they were with the UAE and Bahrain, and then, of course, Sudan and Morocco signed on. When it was announced, the Abraham Accords were announced, much of the world was surprised. They didn't know about it. Contrast that to what was going on trying to get the Saudis, which is the big kahuna in the Middle East. Everybody knew that the Saudis were in negotiations for it. That means Hamas knew that the Saudis were in negotiations for it. Would it not have been better in retrospect to keep those negotiations under wraps? How much of Hamas's decision to attack Israel on October 7th is attached to the fact that they knew that there was the possibility that the Saudis would now enter?
No question that Iran tried to time it in that way. It was very difficult at that time. Remember, the UAE was the first to really go.
Mm-hmm.
MBS himself, Mohammed bin Said, Salman, who's the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, was publicly vocal about
Yeah.
it. Israel was vocal, so it was hard to keep it up. Let me give you an example, though, of what real peace means. So, we have had a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt since Jimmy Carter in 1979. Egypt is a country with 100 million people. In 2024, trade between Israel and Egypt was $300 million. The UAE has 9 million people, and the Abraham Accords are only like 3-4 years old. Trade between the UAE and Israel is near $3 billion. There have been, even with COVID, even during COVID, because there have been 500,000 Israeli visitors to the UAE. I mean, you can count on the fingers of one hand the number who have visited Egypt.
By the way, and in the UAE, though, very few have visited Israel.
That is true. But if you want to get a really great kosher Chinese dinner, go to Dubai.
Yeah.
I've had it.
Me too.
And the number of kippahs walking around Dubai is amazing.
I was fortunate, my wife and I were fortunate to have gone to the UAE. There was 12 rabbis from around the country were invited to, by the governments, UAE, Bahrain, and Israel, to celebrate the Abraham Accords. It was quite an experience. And at the UAE, the Orthodox community has a synagogue, and the synagogue is in the St. Regis Hotel. So it's this and a fellow named Ross, I forgot his last name, but it is extraordinary. By the way, you said there are 9 million. I think there's only 1 million Emiratis, right? And something like 8 million.
That's right. Guest workers.
Yeah, guest workers and the like.
So before we leave Iran, I'd really like, because some of my friends are here from originally from Iran.
And by the way, I'm going to share at the end a little bit about, I won't do it right now, a little bit about the ambassador's role on behalf of Iranian Jews. It's absolutely.
Well, if you want to wait, we can wait.
I want to wait. It's so inspiring. I want to close with it. You're one of them. Yeah. Thank you. We'll come to it. Let's talk about you mentioned, I'm going to talk about a little more about Israel, Camp David. So Camp David and Camp David 1, as you refer to it, in 1978-79, Sadat makes peace. Egypt had been at war, 4 times with Israel? 48, 56, 67, 73, right? By the way, there's a great Henry Kissinger speaks to Golda Meir and says to her, this is an iconic line, I think you quote it. He says to her, to Golda Meir, he says, "I'm an American first, a senior White House official second, and a Jew third." And Golda Meir responded, this is so witty, "Henry, remember, in Hebrew, we read from right to left." It's just brilliant.
I have that in my book.
Yeah. So what, after all this fighting with Egypt, what compelled Sadat, I guess in the late 1970s, to say, I'm going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to make peace? Because you were part of the Carter administration during that time, and that was out of nowhere, it seems. What happened? Why did that work?
First of all, to make peace, you have to be courageous. It's not the courage of a soldier on the battlefield, but it is departing from established norms, departing from what your base wants, and taking a risk. Now, why did he do it? 1973, after the Yom Kippur War, he kicked out the Soviet advisors and decided he wanted to join the West. And he felt that one way to do that was through Israel, because he knew the relationship between the special relationship that Israel and the United States.
So before you even, forgive me for interrupting, why does he go from Egypt being what it is to saying, I want to be a part of the West? What happened to him?
Because he needed the military equipment, and he felt that the Soviets
So it's for practical
had
reasons.
let him down during the
Okay.
73 war.
Okay.
Now, but there's a more profound reason, I think, and that is President Carter made a mistake at the beginning of the peace process and trying to get too much. And this is one of the lessons that I try to impart in the book. If you go for a home run, to use a baseball term, you're going to strike out too many times. So what Carter did is tried to revive Kissinger's Geneva Convention with all 22 Arab countries and Israel, and solve everything at once. Lebanon, Jordan, the Palestinians, Egypt. It fell of its own weight.
Right.
And Sadat said to himself, what I really want is I want to get my Sinai back. I want to get the oil fields, and I want to have what I lost in the 73 war. And that occasioned him, therefore, to say, I've got to take the initiative. I'm going to go to Jerusalem and pledge no more wars. Okay, so he does. Then months go by to try to convert this phrase that he gives to the Knesset, no more wars, into something tangible. That's not a treaty, no more wars. So they negotiate between themselves, and they fail. They can't get anywhere. Carter, over the objection of all of his advisors, decides that rather than let this whole peace initiative fail, he's going to invite them to the presidential retreat at Camp David. And again, everybody was against it. He tries to personalize it in several ways. First, he takes both of them to the Gettysburg battlefield in his presidential limousine. And at that battlefield, he is making the point that wars are going to leave you with more graves And Sadat, who was a general and had studied in the United States, starts telling Carter all the mistakes the Confederates made in losing the battle, which for a Southern president was a little difficult, but more meaningfully, Begin on the spot extemporaneously gives the entire Gettysburg Address. A second way of personalizing is Carter has the first and only all-kosher Shabbat dinner at Camp David and attends the entire thing. Notwithstanding the fact that he did that and that he personally drafted, and what I believe is the greatest presidential personal diplomacy in American history, 22 peace agreements, shuttling between the Egyptian cabins and the Israeli cabins. And we get close, but we're not there. Begin comes on the 13th and last day on a Sunday and says, Mr. President, I'm sorry, I can't and will not compromise anymore. I want you to get me a limousine to take me from here to Andrews Air Force Base. I've got an El Al plane waiting to take me home. Well, Carter, realizing that this would send Sadat home empty-handed, potential assassination, he was assassinated later.
Right.
He had already lost a prime minister, a foreign minister when he went to Israel. He lost a second one at Camp David. The guy resigned in the middle of the negotiations. So Carter, having prepared intensely, had read the CIA profiles on Sadat and Begin and remembered that Begin had a soft spot for his 8 grandchildren. So he gets his personal secretary, Susan Clare, to make 8 copies of the original photo of the 3 leaders when they came in the first day. He autographs each personally to each of the grandchildren, walks over to Begin's cabin, and gives them to Begin, and hears Begin start to vocalize the names of each. President Carter with hope for peace.
Wow.
And he sees Begin's eyes tear and his lips quiver, and he says, Mr. President, he puts his bags down, for my grandchildren, I'll make one last try.
Wow. It's very moving.
And that's preparation. Now, there's another humorous story. Camp David was an accord. It was not a treaty. It was a framework for peace. And it called for a permanent treaty between Egypt and Israel within 3 months. So 3 months go by, 4 months go by, 5 months go by. We're in our 6 months, no treaty. And Carter, again, I can assure you, this is no hyperbole, over everyone's objections, his political advisors, his foreign policy advisors, says to go to the region and try to do shuttle diplomacy and make this happen. Okay, so 3 days of shuttle diplomacy, including meeting with the entire Israeli cabinet. And again, we're close but not there. Air Force One is now, it's a Sunday again, Air Force One is refueled. The airspace over Ben Gurion Airport is cleared. Carter's now dressed down into his flight clothes. And Begin calls and says, I'd like to see the president one last time. And we all thought, well, he's just saying, thanks for coming, I'm sorry it didn't work. So Carter says, entertain the prime minister, who's always very formal, coat and tie. So he puts a coat and tie up at the presidential seat of the King David Hotel. And Begin says, now young men, you know, this is a very famous hotel, the King David. Yes, sir, we know that. But not for the reasons you think. It's famous because when I was head of the underground Irgun, I blew this hotel up, and with British soldiers in it. But don't worry, I'm not going to blow it up again until the president leaves. So he goes up to the presidential suite, and that's where it's signed. Wow. They come down to a waiting press, and the elevator breaks between the first floor and the ground floor of the famous King David. The Secret Service has to pull Begin and Carter out butt first, and I call it the breech birth of the treaty.
That's great. Let me ask you, I have to ask you this because you were obviously close with President Carter. He wrote a book called Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. The central premise of his book is that Israel's control of the West Bank and the building of settlements is the primary, and I use that word advisedly, the primary obstacle to peace. In other words, the primary obstacle to peace, according to President Carter, is Israel, not the Palestinians. You and I would agree that Israel has offered peace to the Palestinians 5 times. Because you were close and because you knew him so well, this book, I think, was a shattering blow to many in the Jewish community who were supporters of him. So I can't think of anyone better to ask than you about your reaction to that book, and did you ever talk to him about it?
Yes, so this came out 30 years after his presidency, and we had actually a 30th conference on his inauguration at Athens, Georgia, University of Georgia. And Ham Jordan, who was his closest aide and chief of staff, said this is the worst thing Carter has done since he left the White House. Now, why? It's the only book that he didn't show to any of his aides, only a nonfiction book. So I'm at Hofstra University, and we have a panel with Erwin Kotler, who was the Jewish Attorney General of Canada, Alan Dershowitz, who is my professor at Harvard Law School, and myself. And before we go on, we're in the green room. Alan comes up and says, Stu, I have to ask you something personally. I've been asked by the New York Times to review your boss's new book. And I said, what new book? And he said, you don't know about the book?
Wow.
And I said, no. And nobody else did. None of his other aides did. And I was just appalled because it said peace or apartheid. And I wrote him a long memo when I came back to Washington explaining that while I didn't support a lot of the settlements, that they were not apartheid. Apartheid was South Africa's minority white government not giving its black citizens the vote. And that while sure there was discrimination against Israeli Arabs as there is against American blacks and others, but they belong to Kupat Holim, which is the health, they have free education, they have members in the Knesset. I mean, they're certainly not in any way, shape, or form like the blacks were in South Africa. And if he's talking about the West Bank has never been annexed. It's contested territory. They don't have to give the Palestinians a vote. And the Jordanians, who had it for 40 years, never gave them a vote.
Well, right. It was taken in 1967 when Jordan attacked them, and there's never even been a case, as far as I remember, of any country after being attacked and losing property giving it back.
So then I followed up the memo with a call, and he said, gee, I wish I had talked to you before the title. And I said, well, here's an easy solution. Just change the title. You don't have to change the cover. Just make it The Challenges of Peace. And he said, well, I wish I had the time, but it's already in the book. On the bookstores, and the trucks coming to the books. It's too late. Why did he have this belief? It's because he equated civil rights and human rights. They were flip sides of the same coin. Remember, the human rights was a major part of his foreign policy. Civil rights, he was a courageous Southern governor who talked about at his inauguration, the time for racial discrimination is over. And he said to me, and I have it in my book on President Carter, that the blacks were treated better by the white police than the Palestinians are by the Israeli soldiers. Now, I think that's a gross exaggeration, but that's the way he looked at it from a human rights standpoint. And he was frustrated at the fact that there was no two-state solution, that the settlements were growing. I mean, when we left office, there were 17,000 settlers on the West Bank. Today, there are 500,000.
Right. No, the issue and I appreciate what you're saying, is when he said they were the primary obstacle. Yes. That it is an obstacle.
And that's also what I agreed with. So, we were talking just beforehand. I went to Columbia University before the second day of Passover because I wanted to see the demonstrations. And I've had now 3 instances on Brandeis, at Harvard, and Emory, and NYU. So the first thing I saw was 150 tents, all identical green REI tents.
Yeah.
Somebody paid for it. Okay. Now, that's not the broader point. What I said is if I could only spend 120 seconds with these students and tell them the following. 1947, UN partitions the British mandate,
Right.
gives part to a Jewish state, part to an Arab state. The Arabs reject it and go to war. 1979, at Camp David, there were no Palestinians at Camp David. Not one. Because we tried to get them there, but Arafat wouldn't agree to the prerequisite in U.S. law,
Right.
which was 242, UN resolution, land for peace. So they weren't there. Then go to Camp David 2 with Clinton, Ehud Barak, and Arafat. And at Camp David 2, they agreed to that is Israel, to the Clinton parameters, which are 95% of the West Bank back to the Palestinians for a Palestinian state. East Jerusalem is a capital, turned down by Arafat. Now, I want to come back to that in 1 second because I have to tell a personal experience. 2005, Eric Sharon, a really hardline guy, decides it's time to pull out of Gaza. All the IDF soldiers are removed, but not before they remove 7,000 Israeli settlers. Now, we should show the video to these kids of the Israeli soldiers taking Israeli settlers, kicking and screaming out of their settlements.
Right.
Okay? And they left the greenhouses, and they left one other thing I'm going to mention in a minute, all destroyed when Hamas took over. 2009, Ehud Olmert, now Israeli Prime Minister, in secret negotiations with Abbas, who is now in his 16th year of a 4-year term as head of the Palestinian Authority, offers 96% of the West Bank, East Jerusalem the capital, and 50,000 Palestinian refugees coming back permanently, rejected.
Yeah.
Now, personal experience. July 2000, I was then Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. My dear friend Susan Lubick is here. Her late husband was working with me in the Treasury. And I was in charge of the economic dimension of the peace process. So I negotiated with Arafat a half dozen times. And in July of 2000, I go to Gaza. And the reason I went to Gaza was that we had gotten Congress to pass a law that's still on the books, and that law was called qualifying industrial zones. So any Arab country, at that time it was only Egypt and Jordan and the Palestinian Authority, which had a peace agreement with Israel, could create an industrial park, and any company in that industrial park that used as little as 10% Israeli content in their final product could ship back duty-free. So here's what I see. 30 plants, not Israeli plants, American plants, Japanese plants, European plants, 30 plants employing 1,200 Gazans, and they took me on a tour of the second phase that was being built. The foundations are already being laid. Another 30 plants, another 1,200 or 1,500 Gazans, okay? So I then go into one of the plants, and I see the product being loaded onto a flatbed truck. It goes right through the Eretz crossing to the airport that at $1.5 billion of your taxpayer money, we got the Corps of Engineers to build for exports. And supervising that entire operation, July of 2000, was one unarmed Israeli soldier. Okay?
Yeah.
That's where we've come from.
We don't have a lot of time, but there's two areas I want to touch on because they reflect specifically on the Jewish people, your role in on behalf of Holocaust victims. Can you take a moment to talk about what you've done on behalf of victims of the Holocaust?
Well, first of all, I
just in the
I
world
was
of
an
art.
unlikely candidate for this because growing up in Atlanta, Georgia, To my knowledge, I never met a Holocaust survivor. So my epiphany occurred in 1968. I had worked a year in the Johnson White House, and then I was Humphrey's research director in the Nixon campaign. And I met there Arthur Morse. Arthur Morse had just written a book using newly declassified records from the Roosevelt administration called While 6 Million Died. And it was a book that cataloged what FDR and his top aides knew and failed to act on. And I was shocked because, I mean, Roosevelt was, as he was in most Jewish homes, a total icon.
By the way, why is that? Why is he a total icon? I know the book you're speaking about, which really shows what he knew, what was happening to Jews in Europe. Why is he held in such high esteem?
Well, he was the commander-in-chief of what we know was the winning navy. He fought the Nazis. He got us in our Holocaust Museum in Washington. We have an exhibit called The American Experience in the Holocaust, and it indicates the degree in the late 30s and early 40s, Rabbi, of the anti-Semitism, the racism, the isolationism that Roosevelt faced. So it was a tremendous burden. I mean, I joked that Jews at the time believed in three things: Die Welt, which in Yiddish means this world; Jene Welt, the world to come; and Roosevelt.
Share what you did. I interrupted you.
Okay,
Forgive me.
so
I want to talk about
anyway,
the world.
I pledged to myself at the age of 25 when I read that book with Arthur Morse that if I ever had a chance in an administration to remove the cloud from an otherwise glorious history of the U.S. in World War II, I would do it. So the first occasion occurred in April of '78 when I recommended to President Carter that he create a presidential commission on the Holocaust chaired by Elie Wiesel, which led directly to the museum that I now chair. But the second occurred, and again, I'll put a footnote on this with the Iranians if you want to come back to that, because I do want to finish with the Iranian Jews. And the second came when I was ambassador to the European Union in Brussels, and I get a call from the Assistant Secretary of State, Richard Holbrooke, and he says that President Clinton has just been visited by Edgar Bronfman. The Cold War is over. Bronfman wants him to appoint a special envoy to give the newly empowered Jewish communities, tiny though they were, the physical infrastructure, the synagogues, the day schools, the community centers, so they can rebuild their shattered lives in Europe. And you're in Europe, we'd like you to do it. So I asked my staff at the European mission in Brussels, and they said, you can't, there's no way you can do this. I mean, you've got a full-time job as ambassador to the EU. I went home to my wife, Fran, and she says, you've got to do it. Remember what you promised yourself with Arthur Morse. So over the objection of my staff, I did it. Dick said, it'll only be 3 months. I'm now in my 20th year. But that really was what did it. And I feel with great passion, and I think, 6 million is a number. 1.5 million kids is a number. But just think of what we lost: the scholarship, the art, the science, and yes, just everyday people eking out a living. Kids not having a chance to live their lives. It's something that haunts me. And so every time I negotiate with the Germans, and I'm now doing it, we did $8 billion worth in the Clinton administration with German and Austrian slave labor companies, with European insurance companies who refused to pay because they said that the account holder, the Jews, didn't pay their premiums when they were in Auschwitz.
Right, it's true.
The Swiss banks,
Right.
which, denied that they had the accounts. I went to, when Holbrooke said you can do this, and I finally got the clearance, I went to Basel, Switzerland, and I had a Wall Street Journal article that said that there were Swiss Jewish bank accounts that had never been accounted for.
Yeah.
And I took the article with me to the Swiss Bank Association. I said, is this true? Yes, we've put our own ombudsman on it. We've looked at every single account, in every bank between 1933 and 1945, including those that are extinct. There are 732, and we're going to plus the interest up for $30 million. Well, we appointed Paul Volcker to head a commission with 4 accounting firms. There weren't 732. There were 49,000.
Wow.
And we negotiated a $1.25 billion agreement. So one thing sort of led to another, but it was all in a way of trying to do, you can't compensate for the loss, but to try to do something more.
Before we conclude with the role of you in the Persian community, I'm curious, are the qualities of a good diplomat and a good negotiator in the international arena the same qualities of a good diplomat and negotiator in the personal arena?
Well, that's a very good question. There are some that are similar, but there are others that are very different because you're not negotiating with a commercial opponent. You're negotiating with another country, a sovereign country that has its own constituency. And I'll let you compare these qualities with what we're seeing in the first months of this administration. First, as with George W. Bush and Baker, you have a fierce determination to seize a historical moment like the collapse of the wall and not be deterred. Second, you have to have political courage. You have to have somebody who's courageous enough. No Palestinian has been courageous enough. Mohammed bin Zayed in UAE was, Sadat was, King Hussein was, but not the Palestinians. They can't give up their right of return. Third is wisdom and good judgment about people. Kissinger and Zhou Enlai showed this in the opening to China. Next, and this is really important, if there's any one attribute that's most important, maybe it's this. It's the ability to listen to the other side. You sometimes get wrapped up in the brilliance of your own presentation, but you think they accept it the same way you do.
That's not helpful. My wife is here tonight. I'm going to hear that all
I
the
didn't say the
way.
brilliance of your sermon. And so you have to put yourself in the other person's shoes. What do they need to take back to make this a win-win situation?
Okay.
You can't grind the other person in. You have to establish. Next is to establish personal relationships, as Baker did with Shevardnadze. Make them a partner of yours, not someone to be humiliated. Be creative, as George Mitchell was in the Good Friday agreements, and honor the agreements that your predecessor reached. So, two contrasts. I've already mentioned what happened when President Trump departed from the JCPOA. The contrast was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan defeated us decisively in 1980 for a variety of reasons, but one was he ran against us on SALT II, the nuclear agreement. He said, we got too little, we gave the Soviets too much. And yet, once he was elected and served, he honored that agreement to the T, even though it had never been ratified, because he realized that if he didn't, he would become a bad negotiating partner. The Soviets would never agree with
He would have lost credibility.
Exactly. So you need all of those attributes, and you need the ability to use leverage. How do you best use leverage, both positive and negative? In a commercial negotiation, if you don't succeed, you walk away, you go to the next deal. If you fail in an international negotiation, the ripple effects can be enormous. And you're going to have to also, this is why you don't want to humiliate them. I mean, buying Greenland, making Canada the 51st state, taking back the Panama Canal over the treaty, and much more. You need these countries in ways you can't appreciate. It may be a vote in the UN. It may be like China with climate change. There's an ongoing relationship which you don't have in a commercial setting.
Let me turn to a nice way to end the evening. So a couple of weeks ago, an article was published in the Jewish Journal by Sam Kermanian. It was literally about 2 weeks ago. and it spoke of your role in saving Iranian Jews. It was called The Modern Day Uncle Mordecai, who saved countless Iranian Jews. It's about you. It's about what you did for Jews during the revolution in 1979, and it remained a secret for nearly 40 years. I guess, too, you must have written about it in your book about President Carter.
Yes.
Can you very, very briefly share what you did for the for the Persian community?
Well, this again was the overhang in the back of my mind of the Holocaust, where we remember that the final solution came in 1942. Jews could leave in 1935, 36, 37. The doors were closed. So the Iranian Revolution happens. Our hostages are taken. President Carter writes an executive order expelling all Iranians in the United States, of which there were more than 50,000, businessmen, people, students studying. They all had to leave within 30 days and go back to Iran.
30 days?
30 days.
Wow.
So I got a call from Sam Kermanian, who was then a young Iranian Jewish student studying in the United States, saying it was desperately important for me to see him. And I went through my secretary. And so he came. I think Isaac Maradi was there and a few others. And they said the following. If we are required to go back to Iran, it's a death sentence. Because the leader of our community, what was his name, Sam? Yeah. That he had been assassinated by the radicals and dragged through the streets of Tehran by his feet. And this is going to be our fate. So I got together an interagency group with the Treasury Department, with the Customs Department, the State Department, National Security Council, and we then had a formal meeting in the old executive office building with Sam and his delegation. And I wanted them to hear the story, the rest of the agencies to hear the story. And we created a special visa category. So anyone who, for religious reasons, would be at risk of going back, and this included Jews, Baha'is, and Christians, would not be subject to being expelled. But we did a second thing, and this was direct link to World War II. Knowing how our consulates were closed to Jews trying to get out of Europe. And that is, we had the president instruct the consulates that any person leaving Iran for religious reasons should get a special kind of visa that would allow them to come in and stay in the United States until the Shah of Iran was restored on the throne, which we knew would be never. And the interesting thing is, this worked. We got 50,000 out.
Wow.
And when we lost the election to Reagan, I got a call, I think maybe Sam again, maybe it was your father, saying they're re-looking at these visas, and they're threatening to send us back out. They didn't know the history of it. So I was then, of course, a private citizen. I called Elliot Abrams, who was on Reagan's national security team, told him of what we had secretly done, and said, you have to keep it secret, but kill this effort.
Wow. So I often conclude these evenings by reading an excerpt, if it's an author, from their book, but I'm not going to do that tonight. I'm going to conclude with some words in the article about you, because I think it really captures, and Sam, you're here, so you wrote it. This is what it says. It will not be an exaggeration to state that most members of our community, the Persian community, who currently live in this country, owe their ability to live here to Stuart Eizenstat and the efforts of that community delegation. Many years later, he stated that what guided his decision to help was the knowledge of how Jewish requests to come to the United States during World War II were denied by the then U.S. administration, and how that fact had led him to commit to help other Jewish communities escape persecution if he was ever placed in that position. I don't think any other words need to be said other than we are deeply honored that you came here this evening. Thank you, Mr.